Love Reigns. That song is from Coleman Care Award. I am excited to have his music featured here, and I am Marcus Holmes, the love activist, here on the Love and Stuff Community Show each Tuesday evening at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And thank you for joining us, whether you're watching here live from the Love and Stuff community or inside of Love and Stuff, or on the Marcus R. Holmes page here on Facebook, or on Twitch TV, YouTube events, or LinkedIn Live. Thank you for joining us. I hope you will click share, tag 5 of your closest Facebook friends or YouTube subscribers, Twitch followers, or LinkedIn connections, Facebook followers, 5 of the more popular ones, to join in today's continued celebration of Women's History Month here in March. Just shortly, we will be on just a year celebrating our first book, Gratefulness Journey Every Day, is almost a year old. And we would love for you to have a copy by going to Amazon, purchasing your copy today. You will be transformed by the work that is within this book. It is a part of my life's work and journey, and I'm happy to have shared it with you. And I hope that you will join on the gratefulness journey every day. 3 things you're grateful for, speaking them aloud 3 times, and sharing them with 3 people gets you on the gratefulness journey every day. So we will be celebrating that 1-year anniversary, and we're inviting other authors and aspiring authors to share the platform with us so that others can learn about your books. We've had a number of authors on to help, especially indie authors, to help get them the publicity, because we understand firsthand what it is. And so we will have them joining us so that you can also partake in their writings as well, as we begin to talk about our second book and the work that is taking place on the journey to more gratefulness and more writing. Also, we are excited that this is our 5th year of the Love and Stuff community, and we will be having a grand celebration this year. Stay tuned for more details on that, as well as celebrating our newest installment's 1st-year anniversary. That's right, 1 year since Sports Talk with Kamau and Felix, 1 year this week. And we'll be celebrating with them on Saturday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 a.m. Central Standard Time, and you should tune in right here to join us. We're going into our celebration, continuing to celebrate Women's History Month. And so parts of this presentation have pre-recorded content, so I wanted to make sure you're aware of that. And we pulled from our special women's celebrations around the journey that women have gone through the suffragist movement, from going to not having the right to vote to being on the ballot and being voted for, right? For the highest, or among the highest offices in our land. And so we thought we would pull from the vault 2 great legal minds, Brenda Braceful, who is a noted attorney and is well known for her litigation and work on the Malice Green trial, which went viral in its time and was worldwide, about the tensions and potential riots that could have happened here in Detroit. She was instrumental in ensuring that justice and balance happened so that there wouldn't be riots. And Valerie Colbert Osamuede, who is also a strong legal mind, and we will hear from both of them in excerpts. So please click share and tag someone to join us and enjoy as we celebrate women's history. I'm always going to bring you passionate stories and exceptional humans. And so today it's no different. I have found two of the most exceptional humans that I've had the pleasure to make their acquaintance and know, and how fitting it is to have these two incredible women 100 years forward from what was the suffrage movement, the franchise and right for women to vote. And so I have noted litigator, uh, civil service commissioner, law guru, Brenda Braceful, and noted attorney and history and constitution and law buff, and Deputy Labor Relations Director, Valerie Colbert Osamuede. Thank you both for joining us on what I know will be a great show, and what happens to be the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington, which we're seeing celebrations around the world relative to that. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But I really wanted to talk to the two of you about this women's suffrage movement, which I think just in some of the things I've learned in reading is fascinating. And fascinating because there are always movements afoot and always people wanting to push forward their agenda instead of a collective agenda. And so I thought that's a very core part of this movement. And I thought it would be interesting in this day and time when there are so many movements, right? And so many needs still in 2020 for movements. We see the NBA, boycotting, if you will, some of the events that are happening. We see the NHL, the hockey league, canceling some games, which was surprising to me for whatever reasons. Take that for whatever you feel it's worth. And also the baseball league, people talking about canceling games. So everybody has movements. We've seen things in recent years with the LGBTQIA and growing movement, right? And of course, the civil rights movement. So I want to talk a little bit about maybe the intersections or overlapping or compete for resources and time and stage and some of that. But I wanted to talk to you both. And just as a way of opening, I was reading about the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 and learning that there was this group of women who wanted to raise women's rights, and about 100 people attended this convention, and 2/3 of them were women. But there are some deep roots relative to the suffragist movement that come from the abolitionist movement. And so I wanted to start there just to talk to you and get your opening comments on that Seneca Falls movement, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton writes these 13, her own response to the Declaration of Independence, right? And she talks about, we are all created equal, men and women. And, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that. What you've learned about that convention and how that has powered what happened to be, I guess, at one point, it was a national suffrage movement and an American suffrage movement. So that, before they merged. So whomever wants to start, welcome to both of you. I appreciate your being here. I always appreciate when you say yes. I do feel like that you love me so much that you'll say yes to me sometimes when you may not want to, but I always want your voices to be trumpeted because you have such a wealth of information. So whomever wants to go first. And just before you start, hello, those that are with us on the LinkedIn, I'm looking at you saying hello, and some folks that are on Facebook. We're also live on Twitch TV and YouTube. And so I want you all to know wherever you're watching from, we're watching your comments. And if you have questions, please, or comments, please drop them in the comments because you're part of the conversation. Okay, who wants to go first?
Well, I can start a little bit just from what I have been listening to and read a little bit. I know that the Seneca Falls was in 1848. Mm-hmm. And up until that time, there was the intersectionality between the rights of women and the abolitionist movement, okay? Because there was this intersectionality between freedom from slavery, and then ultimately that obviously would give rise to women's rights and who weren't seen as citizens either.
Mhm.
And what's interesting though about the Seneca Falls, you mentioned that 2/3 were women, but no Black women were invited.
Mm.
Okay, no Black women were invited to Seneca Falls,
Mm.
and it's interesting because there was some white men, and there was only one Black man who was Frederick Douglass,
Mhm.
and who ultimately was the voice that got the convention to agree to the sentiment that women deserve the right to vote. It was
Mhm.
his voice that led credence to that most important sentiment that these women were seeking.
Mhm.
So if you think about it, while Black women were shoulder to shoulder
Mhm.
with these white women in trying to achieve suffrage, and they were looking at it suffrage for all, these women were really, it's particularly Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who was not at Seneca Falls,
Okay.
were looking at it really as a victory for white women.
Mhm.
And so that's kind of the backdrop of the Seneca Falls convention, when
Mhm.
in actuality, Black women weren't even included in that, even though they were the backbone, as we are in the Democratic Party, the
Mhm.
backbone for the suffrage movement.
Mhm. And I also read somewhere, Val, and good point. And I wanted to get your take on it, but because you already kind of forayed into it, there were these temperance advocates who wanted women to have the right to vote because they thought it would mobilize an enormous voting bloc for them, and that many middle class kind of white people were swayed by the argument that the enfranchisement of white women would ensure immediate and durable white supremacy honestly attained. So was that, to always keep or alienate Black people, whatever rights that they would get?
Well,
Well, go ahead, Brenda.
I
Go
think
ahead.
we have to understand when you look at the history of the United States and in some respects globally, while we hope that the arc of justice will always bend, recognize that white supremacy was ingrained. When they talk about equal rights, it was a qualified equality. And
Mhm.
like, Val so eloquently pointed out, even though the Black women were out there marching, some of the grassroots and the efforts on the ground, many of the Southern and even some of the Northern white women viewed it, their argument was that we will give you a voting block because we will add to the numbers. Not that they were necessarily seeking equality for all women. And it took a number of years, again, it wasn't just a moment in time, it was a movement
Mhm.
before Black women, Native American, Asian women, women in the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, before there was a full achievement. And some would argue we still have voter suppression actively uh, in this day and age. So I do think it's important for us to study history and understand that whenever there's toward some moral good, that you're not moving as one monolithic being. People have different interests. They may not all converge on the same interests. And we see that today with the movement toward criminal justice reform and police brutality and voter suppression, that, being able to find that consensus so that you can achieve the greater good. And I thought it was absolutely amazing that Frederick Douglass stood up and lent his voice and was instrumental in the resolution passing in Seneca Falls. And again, we don't always get those history lessons in school. We hear about Susan B. Anthony, she's on the coin. Can't put Harriet Tubman on, the $20 bill. And so I think it is important for us to, dig deep into the history and recognize that, African Americans have been an integral part of this country since our arrival. And we didn't arrive on cruise ships. We didn't come here to visit. But we still have, with our enthusiasm, with our talents, with our blood, sweat, and tear, been a part of most of in fact, I would say all of the major movements in this country.
Yeah.
And I just think it was so appropriate our new Vice President, Kamala Harris, was nominated during the month of August, which did mark the 100th anniversary.
It's also interesting, even after Seneca Falls, there still was, like I said, this intersection between abolitionists and women's suffrage. But it wasn't until the 15th Amendment, which came around, that would have given Black men the right to vote, that we now see the real elitism and racism that Stanton really held. And it's interesting because if we recall, at this point in time, the Republican Party was the more progressive party. The Democratic Party, of course, was the party that was the party of the South, the party that was, in for denigrating and keeping free slaves down. And it's interesting because when Katie Stanton believed that the Black man was going to receive the vote before the Black woman, before the white woman, she then turned to to become connected with the Democratic white party, under the thinking that she could bring some of these folks over to support the women's rights. And because of that, she began embracing a great deal of their racist rhetoric in order to support white women's suffrage. And she made some very damning statements about not only Black people, referring to them as Sambos, but Asians, Irish people, all of these people. And she basically stated that, how dare you give, I'm paraphrasing because I do have the actual quote, but how dare you give these Sambos, these Young Tongues, these Patricks, and these Hans the vote before you give it to me as an intellectually educated white woman. These people don't know the difference between a monarch and a republic, and can't read the Declaration of Independence or Webster's Speller. And that was what set off this whole racial divide, which lasted for years.
Yeah, and I know that was the start of the National Women's Suffragist Association versus the American Women's Suffrage Association. But in that early movement, I think they wanted more things than just rights. I think they kind of turned toward just wanting rights, correct? They wanted to include access to education and employment, equality within marriage,
property rights,
all
of that,
wages, custody over children, and control over their own body. But it was, it almost as if we're gonna ride the wave and take over the wave if we can get this one thing, which some would say is a smart move, but there's a lot of cost to that, right? Because you do then, put the gender and the white elitist part as your leverage to, to get the right to vote. So her group was totally opposed to the 15th Amendment, right? Because it didn't have language in there for women as well. Brenda, did you want to comment on that as well?
So we had our first Karen that, even though, I can walk with you and help you, I think what she called them, that they would need considerable education because they were the lower order of slaves and immigrants before they would be in a position to intelligently exercise their voting rights. And so we, again, it doesn't in any way diminish the nature of the passage of the 19th Amendment. But sometimes we gloss over the undercurrents that occurred in these movements. And now we look at 2020 and people are just stunned to find out that people still hold some of those views. And what you have to recognize is that, just because it was ratified, by the skin of his teeth in Kentucky to become part of the law of the nation, don't think for a minute that there wasn't a strong opposition to it. And unfortunately, one thing you see politics is when people are on the losing side, they just don't go away and lose quietly. I mean, we still have people who want to cling to the Confederate flag, not recognizing that, okay, that the Civil War was designed to, quote, unite the country. Why are you still looking for a separate flag? People to recognize that, you know, the 15th and 19th Amendment, it was designed to try and bring voting rights to all segments of the country. So why do we still have situations with the upcoming presidential election? You have active voter suppression efforts. It's because even though the legislation was enacted, I'm not sure we had a change of heart.
Yeah. And I want to go back a little bit because you talked about the Civil War. That's when the suffrage movement kind of slowed down a little bit, but you still found us doing what we do, people doing what they do, supporting side by side their causes, whichever side they were on, helping during times of war, leading up to the 1880s, where I think there was the idea that both the national suffrage group and the American suffrage group wouldn't be able to exist on their own. And they came together, looks like around 1990. So I want to ask you about that. This 1990 coming together, and it looks like at that time, Wyoming was the only state that had granted women the right to vote. That it appears the national suffrage movement took it as a state by state initiative. And so it looks like Wyoming was the first. And then in 93, Colorado, Utah in 96, and Idaho in 96 as well. Why do you think it was more acceptable out West? There are so many different schools of thought relative to that, but it seemed to be a little bit more amenable out West for women to get the right to vote.
Well, I think part of it, again, if you look at the Constitution, basically the 19th Amendment, it didn't necessarily, it just removed the gender barrier. In fact, it actually used the word sex. They didn't say gender, that you couldn't discriminate on the basis of sex. But the states had always maintained the right to establish the criteria for voting, be it residency or other qualifications. So I think with some of the Western states where you had, you know, migration and population, and it was forging kind of a new path, I think that there was less resistance. Recognize that you still had the kind of the old line United States in the eastern part, which was, in their view, more settled, probably more sophisticated, a higher level of education. And so I think there you had a greater adherence to a caste system, that you had the elite, the educated, you had the skilled workers, the trades, and then you had the menial workers. And so I think that that was more ingrained in the East, whereas I think for the population migrating to the West, that was less of a factor. And so they were just looking at numbers.
Right.
We're going to let the women vote because given the way the representation was staggered, even though each state would get 2 senators, the other representation was based on population.
Okay. And Val, anything to add to that? I know that the British suffrage movement was much more militant and much more confrontational. So I don't know, it doesn't seem like that carried over to the eastern part of the United States as quickly, but it seemed like you're right, the population happening out West, and women, you know, performing many of the same tasks as men might have contributed to that out West as well. You know, Midwest and East, it seemed like they were just still stuck, even though people were coming from the British suffrage movement. It wasn't like they were adopting that militant stance.
No, and a matter of fact, the folks in the East, I don't want to say East, but the more, and I agree with you, Brenda, you had this more established elitism, you know, all of that, you know, founding fathers and that kind of thing in the East, and even in the southern states, some of the southern states. But, you know, even the the movement tried to even
Oh, Val, we had you.
bring in labor into their movement, and that did not work. Can you hear me? I mean, they even tried to bring in the labor into the cause, and that didn't go well because of elitism as well. You know, they saw them as these urban, you know, poorer, even poorer white men and women who, you know, really did not have the intellectual acumen to be exercising the right to vote. So I think you know, how the West was won. You know, we have all these stories about how the West was won with all kinds of that regales you with all kinds of independence that came that way. I think that probably filtered into how the movement, you know, was in the Western states as well.
And I want to just pause for a second and say hello to the folks that are on LinkedIn. You're very welcome to comment. Those that are on Facebook, thank you for joining. Kim, God is my hero, Jones, Willie Rogers, Marilyn Hamilton, Elsie Colbert, Lynn Shaw, thank you all for joining. Click, share, and tag someone to join us in the discussion. I'm talking with Brenda Braceful and Valerie Colbert Osamuede about the suffrage movement. Right now, we're talking about the suffrage movement, which is 100 years ago ratified the 19th Amendment. And in that year, more than 8 million women went to the poll to vote. And so I don't want to jump too far ahead, but of course that's in my mind. Women fought and stood and worked to get the right to vote to this sacred franchise. And then in current day, we have some statistics that tell us white women largely voted for Trump last time.
And it's interesting you should say that, because one of and I think Brenda touched on it a bit, the rhetoric for providing women with the right to vote was that women would vote as a block. They were going to be voting as a block to deal with some of the social and moral issues that, you know, men did not tend to. And we've never seen white women vote as a block. They still don't vote as a block. Black women do. Black women vote as in a block, as has been demonstrated over the last 4 years, and certainly through these recent primary elections, and which is one of the reasons why the Democratic Party is reckoning today with you know, the fact that Black women voters are a sophisticated block of voters that now have gained the attention of really all of the political groups around. But the fact of the matter is, they do vote more as a block in the sense that they look at things that are more intersectional with community education and voting rights and, you know, housing, all of those things that Black women go out and participate in grassroots organizations to support. Not only benefits Black women, it tends to benefit all of the communities.
That was part one of a fantastic interview. I'm Marcus Holmes, the love activist, and I love when people get engaged in the process. And you will hear throughout this year how we will raise the theme of lift every voice and vote, because it's an important aspect. And while we are in Women's History Month, we thought we'd take a look back at one of the interviews here in the Love and Stuff community with two great legal minds, that of Brenda Braceful and Valerie Colbert Osamuede, two great legal minds who are actually a part of our committee to draft our manifesto to lift every voice and vote. And we see throughout a varied history that women have stood up, sometimes along their counterparts, that their white counterparts, but have stood up for the right to vote. And so we're taking a look at the suffragist movement because women have gone from fighting for the right to vote to being on the ballot for some of the highest offices in the land, right? And so we want to, in our history, take a look and reflect on some of those sacrifices made by women and some of the unique contributions that were made by women during this month of March and throughout the year as we seek to get you to pledge to make a difference in places like Georgia, where Stacey Abrams is positioning herself to win that gubernatorial race, which will be critical, and to secure those seats that are in jeopardy in the Senate as well. Lift every voice and vote. And so we thought we would take some time. I know we talk a lot about love and stuff. This is part of the stuff I think that we are called to talk about that has to do with the right to vote. And it happens again in the month of March that we get to take a keen look at the contributions of women. We are live here on Love and Stuff community page, inside of Love and Stuff, the Marcus Our Homes page here on Facebook. We're on LinkedIn Live. We're on Twitch TV and YouTube events. And if you're on any or all of those platforms, join us and click share. Tag 5 of your closest connections, Facebook friends, YouTube subscribers, or Twitch TV followers, 5 of the more popular ones, to help us to herald and lift up the voices of women. We will be right back for interview part 2. And we're going to take a quick break and listen to the voice of Ursula Merritt Bird, who is singing a little bit of Sarah Vaughan's Misty jazz.
Misty, sang by Sarah Vaughan. Look at me, I'm as helpless as a kitten up a tree, and I feel like I'm clinging to a cloud I can't understand. I get misty just holding your hand. Walk my way, and 1,000 violins begin to play, or it might be the sound of your hello, the music I hear. I get misty the moment you're near. Can you see that you're leading me on? And it's just what I want you to do. Don't you notice how hopelessly I'm lost? That's why I'm following you on my own. When I wander through this wonderland alone, never knowing my right foot from a left, my hat from my glove. I'm too misty and too much in love. We're too misty and too much in
That was Ursula Bird Merritt. Thank you so much, Ursula, to give us a quick break from our women's history. And what an excellent gift and voice, educator and singer, music and vocal pedagogy instrumentalist, and we're grateful for her gift. And thank you so much. We're going to get back to a part two of the interview. We'll share part two of this interview with you, talking about the suffragist movement, going from suffragist to being on the ballot in 2022, 2021, but 2022, as we look forward to many women standing forward, not only at the Supreme Court, which we are so pleased, though we know that there are those that will try to block her appointment to the Supreme Court. But there are many women who are and have served, and who we hope that will serve our great and fine country during this hour when their voices are so needed. We are going to interview part two with Valerie Colbert Osamuede and Brenda Braceful, talking about women's history relative to the suffragist movement.
Everybody's community, not just their community. And we see that in the women's suffrage movement. Once the women got the right to vote, the white women got the right to vote, they never once again picked up the mantle of racism.
So I want to make sure that we are able to. All right. Looks like we are. Okay. Let's just make sure we are. All right. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, they thought that they had achieved what they wanted to achieve, and they either didn't care or didn't want to have the hassle of dealing with racism in this country as white women voters. And that has kind of resonated to the current day.
Mm-hmm. And so that what did they say? 52% of white women voted for your president. So 52% of the women voted for white women. What is that?
Well, again, and I'm sure there are greater minds than mine who have studied the demographics and the patterns and voting. But to quote one of the founding fathers, you really won't have effective social change not affected are as outraged as the people who are affected. Okay. And like we said earlier, even during the early days of suffrage, labor didn't want to come on board, and some of the political they thought the women might be opposed to child labor laws, and that was going to cut into their profits and economics. And so as a block, you had women who were interested in securing their personal freedom and release. I can't even sign a contract because I'm married. In fact, they had challenges even renting some of the halls where they were having their meetings because they weren't legally able. So once I achieved my individual goal, then do I still have the same passion for the societal goal? And I think, and this is just my speculation, I think, many white women, they've been beneficiaries of civil rights. Affirmative action didn't just help African American students, it has helped female students. And the percentage of female students in your professional schools increased exponentially.
Yeah.
And maybe people just feel it's easier for me to reach out to my sister and my daughter than to the person who's coming to clean my house. And so they may not, while there certainly is discrimination, there's, I don't know that there's the same level of malevolence that we encounter. And so they may not feel compelled on the social issues. And if you're looking at the economics of it, I have opportunities. I'm reasonably certain, even if I have to pay somebody, I can get my child into school. And that's just a side note, and then I served 14 days or so. But, so I'm coming from a different place. I'm not as committed to the general social goals of society. Even though I have a home, I'm worried about homelessness.
Right.
Hell, I'm very tuned into the criminal justice problems in this country. Even though I can survive a traffic stop, I fear for my sons and my grandsons. So, it's not just my personal situation. I'm looking at society and the general good for not just me and not just my family, but my community. Right. And I think we may be coming from a very different place.
So you think that theirs is more rugged individualism, ours is more communal?
Yes. It's like, oh, this mask.
You're going in and out. I hate to interrupt, but I want to make sure everybody can hear you. You're kind of going in and out.
And we all the posting on Facebook where, Karen doesn't want to wear a mask. And I hate to use that phrase, but it's convenient. We know, I don't want to wear a mask because it makes my glasses fog up. Forget that I'm going to take a virus home to my 95-year-old mother and it may kill her. Or that these healthcare workers now have to risk their lives to come in because it's about how it affects me. And part of that, I think, is we're raised, when we were coming up, it wasn't just enough that we ate. There was concern that your neighbors have food, your family have food. Through our churches, if we had food, everybody was going to get something. And so I think there is a different attitude toward whether or not, and I think for some people it's scriptural. I mean, the greatest commandment is to love your neighbor. So you have as part of your very fabric what is good for us collectively, not just what is good for me.
Now, did you want to add anything to that?
No, it's interesting because I was listening to someone. I was trying to find my note on it, but they were just talking about how the weaponizing of white womanhood, okay, and how that has always been utilized and was utilized in the fight for suffrage, and we see it today that in the fact that we still utilize white womanhood as a weapon as it relates to the broader society, and actually allowing us to achieve so-called rights. And if you look at, like I said, if you look at even what Stanton did, in the fact that she weaponized white womanhood, in the sense that both Stanton and Anthony knew that that Black men probably needed the right vote more so at that time than white women, because of what they were experiencing, the violence that they were experiencing in the South. And even though they recognized that, they knew that the same thing was not equal for women. They didn't have that same moral imperative, which is why it was interesting, like I said, when I was reading and trying to understand some of this stuff, which is one of the reasons why they came up. Actually, it was Stanton who perpetuated the myth of the Black rapist. And she made a statement about how if pretty much that if the black man received the vote over the white woman, that this would perpetuate this kind of and I wish I could find the quote that I was looking for, but she perpetuated that myth, which for centuries was, which from that point on, from the 1860s on, actually was used by the white Democratic Party to subjugate and to substantiate and justify lynchings based on her need to want to get an equal moral imperative in order to get the vote for white women. It is, it is fascinating how she pretty much chose to compromise equality for everyone, for this one right to vote for white women only.
Actually, she reduced it to writing. She wrote an article.
She did. Mm-hmm.
And she said, American women of wealth, education, virtue, and refinement.
Right.
If you do not wish the lower orders of Chinese, Africans, Germans, and Irish with their low ideas of womanhood to make laws for you and your daughters, then you must demand that women too shall be represented in government. So, I mean, that was the appeal that, we cannot have these low class, know nothing, deciding what's going to happen to these educated genteel.
Right. And that was the vote. That was the quote I was trying to look for.
Right.
And that was used throughout the 1860s up until through the Civil Rights Movement to justify lynching. Her statement was utilized to justify that. That blew me away when I read that, because even with that, she continued to link herself with that party because she thought that the Democratic Party at that time would be more apt to giving the women the right to vote than the Republican Party at that time. And quite frankly, neither of them wanted to. Neither the Republicans or the Democrats wanted to give women the right to vote, So that was, that's very interesting and that's when I say the weaponizing of white womanhood. She did that.
And that's fascinating. When you were talking about that, it made me think of the Central Park situation in New York. I'm like Brenda, but Karen has been so popularized, we're using it. And so the Karen says it's a black man, right. The fact that he was a black man was reason for her to have to call the police and you wonder how deeply rooted in the DNA that is. And you've just given us, one of the things that has propelled that whole thought of portraying the black person or black man as something nefarious or something criminalized.
Right.
Occupant of the White House, when his statement about, we don't want low income families moving into the suburbs and appeal to the suburban housewives, that you want to keep your neighborhood safe. I mean, that is just directly a page out of that playbook.
Yes.
That, you got to be careful because they're coming to your neighborhood.
Yeah. I want to come back a little later and ask how we penetrate some of that, because I think it is deeply ingrained in people that there is something nefarious about the African in America, because we do want white women to vote. It's been 100 years and you got that right. We just want you to vote on the right side of the situation. But if thinking anything that's going to bring equality or equity to these people that are nefarious or criminalized is in the DNA or in the psyche of people, how do you penetrate that? I want to come back to that because I want to hear from your great minds on that. Those of you that are just joining us, thanks, Tawana Mann, Bishop Celestine Todd. Thank you all for coming and joining us. I'm talking with Brenda Braceful and with Valerie Colbert Osamuede. We're talking about the suffrage movement, and we're learning some facts that maybe we didn't know if we hadn't read about it. And I hope that you will invite others to tune in. A couple of other facts I want to get your take on that are maybe not as well known facts to us that I didn't know about the movement. We talked about the Britain's women's suffrage movement was far more militant than its counterpart here in the US. We also talked about, the movement having deep roots in the abolitionist movement, and that there was a parting of ways because of that for the two movements. Susan B. Anthony and 15 other women, I read, voted illegally in the presidential election of 1872.
They got pardoned by 45 recently. Just throwing that in.
No, I did not know that.
I
didn't know they voted illegally, and I didn't know that they got pardoned. But now I want to say, so why don't we want everybody to vote? If you can do it illegally 100 years ago, let's go ahead and do it legally.
Well, I think that was just another example that he doesn't understand history.
Right.
And it was interesting because the Susan B. Anthony Museum declined to accept his pardon. They rejected it. And truly that.
So I keep missing part of your words. I don't know if
as usual, looking for a photo op and didn't truly understand what had been Susan B. Anthony's position or the knowledge that she had voted illegally. And so it's interesting if you're taking the machines out of the post office and trying to make it hard for people to vote, and then you pardon one of the first persons to engage in voter fraud. So.
Right.
Right. Just why I was blown away by that. I was like, really? So now, here we're doing all this voter suppression and we have people voting illegally. Another fact, the women's rights movement launched its own fashion craze. I used that in the promo, the bloomers and Amelia Jinks Bloomer, the whole wearing of the, getting rid of the bulky hoop skirt and wearing a more, not as hoop top, I guess you would call it, and then the bloomers.
Katie Stanton often said women shouldn't have to wear 15 pounds of iron, iron to bring in their, of corsets and 15 pounds and layers of fabric, that they should be free from that. So that obviously is an outshoot from that, because she was definitely vocal about, even the trappings of our dress was oppressive.
Yeah. Brenda, you want to add anything? No? Okay. A woman ran for political office nearly 50 years before women got the right to vote. And I didn't know Victoria Woodhull ran for president. Did not know that. Okay. And let's see. And then one of the other facts is Alice Paul. She did lead a more militant regime, if you will, that she got from the England suffrage movement. And she was arrested and jailed several times for her work in a more militant fashion. And they talked about the Night of Terror, where they, I guess, boycotted and demonstrated outside of the White House and at a workhouse where 30 women were brutally beaten. And so they were trying to lobby then President Woodrow Wilson to do the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So those were some little known facts that were little known to me. So I had some education in knowing that people, really undergirded movements to move forward their agendas. And so I think, some people in this day and time discount that kind of organized movement. And to me, they don't really understand history, that's been an important part of moving agendas forward into history. Do you agree with that?
Oh, I agree.
Oh, I do. And I absolutely agree. And one thing that we, when we're looking at the suffrage movement. And we do look at, of course, Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, but we got to also not lose sight of our Black suffragists, Ida B. Wells, and some of these other women who were important to Sojourner Truth, who actually, when there was that split that occurred, when Frederick Douglass and others called out Stanton for her racist rhetoric, and they formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, and then Stanton and them had the National Women's Suffrage Association. Sojourner Truth actually stayed with Stanton because she still saw them trying to get the vote for all, which really was not true. So and then you had people who Black women who started their own grassroots organizational groups in order to educate Black people. And there's one really important woman who I was listening to a program which was really fascinating to me. Her name was I think it was Adela Hunt Logan. Can't remember exactly. But this woman, she was a woman who was very, very fair. And she would go and pass for white in order to be a part of these conventions that Stanton and Anthony were having, so that she could get the information and all of that, so that she could get the information and pass it along to Black people so that they could start fighting the literacy test, the poll tax, all of the things that were put in place to stop us from voting in the South. They were bringing back that information to try to fight that. And, this was a Black woman who chose to pass in order to get that information, to bring it back to Black people, because you didn't have people like Anthony and Stanton educating them in order for them to increase their right of the franchise. So it's really interesting how we have to be careful or mindful that while we're elevating Susan B. Anthony and others, that we have a lot of Black suffragists that were made important strides in that movement on behalf of all women. And ultimately, even with the passage, and I think Brenda mentioned this, even with the passage of the 19th Amendment, it wasn't until 1965 that all women got the right to the franchise. And even today, the franchise, the suffrage movement is very fragile, because we still out here trying to promote, the free and fair access to the ballot.
Yeah, I do want to, I know you mentioned many of the abolitionists and many of the women suffragists of African-American descent. And I did want to ask you this before I pivot, and if Brenda wants to respond as well. Ida H. Harper co-wrote with Susan B. Anthony, "In the indifference, the inertia, the apathy of women lies the greatest obstacle to their enfranchisement." And I'm wondering, I'm asking this question because I'm wondering if Senator Harris kind of represents that for women. I don't know, are women ready to have a woman in the White House?
I think so, because I think, out of every test, there is a testimony, and sometimes when you have a challenge, it's also an opportunity. I think we recognize that, you have to look at a person's character, the way they conduct business, how they run their campaign. That tells you a lot about how they will operate. Because let's face it, when you ascend to the presidency, that is unlike any job you've ever had before. And one of the things that's an indication of how you're going to manage that is your character, how you run your campaign, how you run your business, how you conduct yourself, because you're basically, the first day you step into office, that's the first experience you have holding that office, even though it is one of the most powerful offices in the world. And I think we now recognize that, in order to have someone who's committed to try and do what's best for the country. And so, having had this experience for the last 10 years, I think people are looking more closely at what can a person bring to the office. And I think she brings the intelligence, the drive, the understanding of complex issues, the preparation, that there should be a great deal of comfort that she is in that spot. Because we certainly see what happens. I found it was interesting. This is just kind of that knowing that there was the COVID-19, the Democrats decided months ago we're going to have a virtual convention because it won't be prudent to have people gathering together. The Republicans, city to city to city, trying to find some place where they could violate social distancing laws, and a week before say, okay, I guess we'll have to go virtual, and then still try to manage a way to have crowds of people. But at some point, if you just continue to fly in the face of reason and expert advice, then maybe that's why the COVID-19 situation has been so badly managed in the United States. And so I think, when you look at that, okay, we didn't know we were going to have a pandemic like we did with the Spanish flu, but maybe if you had a better sense of organization, a greater concern and empathy for people, it would have been managed better. So there's a lesson for us all to learn from what we experience.
And so, Val, on that point, do you think women will get in the way of, do women get in the way of women when it comes to politics?
Sometimes, but I can only speak from, I can speak from my experience. The women I know, no, but having, gone to, I went to an all-female high school. And I say that because it definitely has shaped who I am, because it gave a lot of latitude to be, in leadership roles, and ordinarily you might not aspire to in a co-ed environment. We all know that happens with, when boys and girls are put together. Girls tend to tend to hide their intellect and tend to kind of let the boys go and do the leadership roles. Mm-hmm. And I can say, even in that environment where women were being equipped to be leaders and equipped to be women who make a difference, that's actually our slogan, women who make a difference. I can absolutely see where there would be a reticence to a woman leader. That was a while ago. I don't know if that's true now. And my daughter, of course, went to the same school. So I don't know if that's true now. But I do think that, I think as a whole, I think women of color and Black women are there. Mm-hmm. I think that, it's just like was mentioned earlier, if you're voting your own interest, you may not want to look beyond a traditional or what is going to perpetuate your comfort level, and so you may not even want to look at another candidate because it's something, it may be something that ultimately you may lose some of your comfort level, maybe not all of it. But I think that on the whole, most women are ready to receive a woman in that higher leadership. I really do. And I think that, as much as you want to say about Hillary Clinton, she did put a bunch of cracks in that ceiling. And someone made the statement, which I thought was very interesting. She was the tip of the spear. Now the spear is being pushed all the way through. Somebody has to be the tip. And then there's always the inertia that pushes something through. And so that's her legacy. And now I think we do have in our minds that we're ready to push through a woman in the highest level of leadership in this country. It's unfortunately that we're last, because all across the world, women are in leadership capacities, all across, prime ministers and running countries and all of that, yet we still cannot have a female president.
Yeah. Global attention, again, the pandemic has kind of brought to the forefront, unfortunately, when you look at those countries where you have female leaders, it has been managed much more compassionately and much more efficiently. And there's been a stark difference. For 45 to talk about New Zealand having a spike, they had 5 cases in the whole country. We're losing 1,000 people a day. And he's like, I'm washing my hands of like Dr. Pilot because I'm not responsible. And I think people are looking at that and realizing that there are certainly instances where it's not about gender, it's about character and the skill set that you bring to the situation. And if a woman presents with that, now again, I'm not naive. I recognize that, there won't be 100% because there will still be people who value their individual comfort over what's even good for them. I mean, people sometimes will vote against their own self-interest.
Right.
Yeah. But I just think in terms of moving the country off that spot, I think the time is right for that. And we certainly have a person who presents with the credentials and the abilities and the skill to make the case. So I'm optimistic.
Yes. And speaking of the times, I would be remiss if I didn't get your take on the 57th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I'm just going to walk through some of the things that are involved in the timeline up to that point. And if you want to remark and share on any of those, I'd like that. And then at the end, I want to ask you, in 1963, where were you and what were you doing when that March on Washington happened? Maybe you were a toddler, I don't know, but I'd just like to know. So let me go to first, 1941, labor leader A. Philip Randolph calls for a march to highlight the exclusion of African Americans from roles in the national defense. Either of you want to comment on that?
And again, I think he's a person in history that we don't spend enough time focusing on, because he was definitely a forerunner in terms of mobilizing us collectively. And it was designed to exert some pressure. And President Roosevelt did issue an executive order on June 25th, a few days before the march was scheduled. And that order established the Committee on Fair Employment Practices and banned discriminatory hiring practices in the industry, the defense industry. So A. Philip Randolph called off the march because the threat of the march had achieved its goal.
Okay. Okay. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. The Supreme Court unanimously rules that racial segregation of children in public schools is unconstitutional.
Well, obviously that's the landmark case that took us all the way down to desegregation, so had it not been for that, who knows? But enough can't be said about the momentous movement that happened as a result of that monumental, and a lot of blood, sweat, and tears from the 30s to that point in time was culminated in that particular victory in the Supreme Court.
1955, Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy, is brutally murdered in Mississippi for allegedly flirting with a white woman. Till's death and acquittal of his murders brings international attention to the civil rights movement. And so, Val, that made me think about the Susan B. Anthony, creating this thought of.
Right. And again, it's interesting because they've been doing a lot of parallels with Emmett Till and black men being murdered in the streets, as always, we owe really a debt to his mother for allowing that picture to be forever ingrained in our psyche as to what they did to that young boy, because he was a boy. He was not a man, he was a boy. And for a crazy youthful indiscretion that he didn't even probably realize was an indiscretion based on where he was coming from. And then you see the same kind of mutilation of our black men in the streets for everybody to see. There's a parallel there. There's a parallel there.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in right before Brenda does. Just seeing the picture and hearing the stories when I was very young. Of course, after that time, but very young, I never thought it was okay to be attracted to white women. As a matter of fact, Cheryl Ladd and Farrah Fawcett, I thought were beautiful white women, but I was afraid to say it.
Yeah.
Because the thought of voicing that in the wrong group or around the wrong people could lead you to wherever. I always had to swallow twice thinking to say it.
And I think it also shows the power of visual depiction, because
right.
While there certainly have, and unfortunately, Emmett Till just ushered in a whole line of men and boys who have been treated so unjustly. But I think that was one of the reasons that the George Floyd incident so resonated with people. Video depiction of a man with his knee on the neck of a man, looking at the camera, completely composed and unapologetic. And when George Floyd called out for his mother, I think, every Black woman who had a son, a nephew, a young boy at church that came and got candy from you, I mean, it just really, it touched you. And I think that's why there was globally such a reaction to that, you can actually snuff out a person's life, because it didn't just take a minute or 2 minutes. We're talking 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And at no point did you ever think it was appropriate to release that pressure.
Yeah.
And so, it's definitely, while we have certainly made some great strides, it just is a very, very difficult reminder that there's still so much.
Yeah. 1955 as well, in December, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on a Montgomery, Alabama bus. Her decision prompts a year-long bus boycott. Okay. 1957, 9 Black teenagers known as the Little Rock Nine are prohibited from integrating into Little Rock Central High School in Arkansas. In response, President Dwight D. Eisenhower sends federal troops to escort them. Okay.
That's another visual that's unbelievable when you see that, you got to have the National Guard to give you access to education.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that's interesting, I was, when you read some of the stories of the students, how they were in a classroom by themselves with a teacher. They couldn't go to the lunchroom. The teacher had to escort them to the bathroom. And we're not talking ancient history.
No,
We're
no.
talking, only 60 years ago.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
1961, across the South, freedom riders protest segregated bus terminals and attempt to use whites-only restrooms and lunch counters. Okay. 1963, in April, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. helps lead the Birmingham Campaign, a desegregation effort in Alabama that includes a series of lunch counter sit-ins, marches, and boycotts of merchants. King is arrested and while in solitary confinement writes letters from Birmingham jail.
And let me just say, I wish people would read that letter. It was funny because, you hear about it all the time. And I think it was probably a year and a half ago, maybe, that I said, let me just really sit down and read this letter, because there's so much, watering down of Dr. Martin Luther King. This man was radical in thought, okay? He was radical in what he was trying to achieve, and that letter actually really encapsulizes what he thought of in terms of even why we riot. It encapsulizes and brings out and calls out the church, particularly the white church. It calls out the white clergy. It calls out all of these people who call us, who say they're colorblind, which, that's a whole different thing. But it calls out all of those good moral people to action. And that letter to me is transformative. If you sit down and really read that letter, there's no way that you walk away thinking that Martin Luther King was not a radical thinking man and leader of his time.
Wow.
That's kind of interesting with some of the recent protests. You've had some of these, Republican elected officials try and use Martin Luther King to say this is not what he would endorse. And I'm like, well, if you read letters from a Birmingham jail, but he basically would condemn and is silent because justice is ordained by God, and God would cry out at injustice. And how can you possibly stand on the sidelines and be silent and call yourself a Christian? I mean, you cannot be a racist Christian. You can be a racist, you can be a Christian, but you can't be a racist Christian. And so, again, I think, and maybe that's just a problem in society. Sound bites or, one tag. It was much, much more than that. He definitely, he believed in nonviolence in terms of the methodology. But he was not in any way passive about demanding vigorously and adamantly that we were entitled to equal treatment.
Yes. And then in August 28th, 1963, at least 250,000 people attended the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Dr. King delivers the I Have a Dream speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial. And so first tell me where you were and what impact you feel that this has had on you, community, and society.
Well, I'll go first because I'm sure I'm the oldest. I was 12, but I was very familiar with Dr. King. In fact, I was looking for, because I still had a pamphlet from the march that they did in Detroit, and a copy of the picture with him walking arm in arm with C.L. Franklin and some of the other local clergy. And so I wanted to go to the march, and my parents, did not think it was prudent for me to join in some groups, because there was some buses and groups and people going. Like I said, at the time I was only 12. But I guess I just felt such a sense of pride that this man could stand in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial and speak to the world, advocating that we just want to be judged by the content of our character, not the it's just hard not to be moved by just the enormity of that moment and all that it entailed. Although as I got older and I was doing some research, I find it interesting that, in Washington, they were braced for, quote, a riot. And they ordered initial plasma for the hospitals. They had called out. And so to have 250,000 people, and even though they were angry, even though they were upset, it was a peaceful demonstration. But it was a tremendous show of force. And I think we need to recognize that, collectively, we can move that needle.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And Val?
Well, I was 2. So I was a 2-year-old when that happened. So of course I really kind of learned about it through history and through my family. And like Brenda, when I studied it, it was always amazing to me how really frightened John Kennedy was, the president was, and everyone was afraid that there was going to be just this mass of violence that was going to resonate in DC. So much so, as we know, through John Lewis, that they wanted him to change his speech because his speech was too incendiary, that he thought it was going to, just kind of incite riots. And it's interesting, it was only Martin Luther King that could get him to change those words, and he did it for the good of the movement. And even then, if you listen to his speech, it's pretty radical. Okay. So, I, of course, learned about the Wild on Washington, like most people, through history books, but through my own parents, who were there experiencing it and were a part of this living history. I often tell people, that was so, and so much so I can even remember when Martin Luther King was assassinated. I was still a young child, but I remember my mother coming home. She was shopping on the Avenue of Fashion, and she came home in tears. And that's when we found out that, Martin Luther King had been assassinated. But, it's always amazing how we look at that moment. I look at that moment that this man and that movement, brought in all of these people at that moment in time, Black people and what we call now allies to the movement, and if you can replicate that again today, it's unthinkable. It's almost unimaginable what we can do to change some things. If we can have that kind of solidarity and that kind of unity in thought, and also get out of unity of thought and ego pushed aside, humility of leadership and recognition that someone has to lead. I can't even conceptualize what we could do to change this country and the world.
Yes. Well, I am so thankful that both of you took out the time to be with me to talk about the suffrage movement and about some facts of the civil rights movement. I think our collective community has learned a lot. If there was any one thing that you could share walking away, especially since we are handing to another generation the hopes of a more equitable and beloved community, what would you hand to them from these movements about their role and impact in making a difference in the world, unless the Lord decides to come back, but the world ahead?
Well, one of my favorite quotes from Martin Luther King is that we need leaders not in love with money, but in love with justice, not in love with publicity, but in love with humanity, and to recognize that, you know, change won't necessarily happen overnight. When we talk about these movements, you know, it took a lot of planning. People had to form alliances. They had to have an action plan. They had to have demands for certain specific activities. And so don't be discouraged because it doesn't happen overnight. That's not a reason for us to lose the momentum. We see a wrong and we have the power collectively to right it. We first have to look at our leaders. And I mean, I just, if you're in love with publicity and not humanity, then you're not going to be worried about leading for the public good. We need to vote. You know, there's a lot of conversation about whether or not your vote counts. When you look at the winning margin in some of the swing states in the last election, every vote counts. And if we're truly committed to trying to improve the plight of our fellow man, we need to have, I'm talking about 85% turnout, not, you know, just, oh, I couldn't make it. And there may be some barriers. We may have to take our absentee ballot and drive it to the clerk's office, but it is worth the effort because it's when we show that force. It doesn't have to be illegal force, it doesn't have to be burning, but the force that we are going to remain committed until this happens, that change will come.
And I have to echo too, what I would like to leave or impress upon this our new generation of leaders, those that are out there right now, you know, in the streets protesting, is again, you know, we live in an instant society now. You know, we can get instant facts, instant information. We got apps for everything. We can, you know, all of this. It leads us to believe that there can be instant change, and it can't be. Change is not instantaneously. I want people to appreciate that change is progressive. It doesn't mean you stop pushing for change, but change is progressive. It doesn't mean that, you know, now you're asking us to wait. No, we're not asking you to wait, but to understand that, you know, alliances, like you said, have to be made. Minds have to be changed. And alliances and allyships have to be forged, not only in our leadership, but in our everyday lives. When our friends and neighbors who are not Black, you know, start to embrace and understand the need for this change, that's when you see it. But that takes time. You know, it takes time to demonstrate change. I mean, that's why what you say and what you do is so important, because it's reflective. You know, people are watching you. So, but that would be what I would want to leave, is that, yes, continue to march, continue to put your things that you want redressed out there, continue to speak truth to power, to continue to be in these streets if you need to be heard, but recognize that there has to be a leader. You know, it has to be a leader. There has to be a cohesive plan put together. You know, like I said, the Brown versus education just didn't happen overnight. There was a plan that led up to that particular litigation being brought all the way to the Supreme Court. There was a plan to get all of the data and the information to show that there was not separate and equal. All of that was planned methodically and over many decades to get to a point where change happened. And people have to understand, you may just be the first person to hand off the baton and somebody else is going to run the race. And that's what we have to understand. It's not instantaneous. You know, I might be running this leg of the race in 2020, but somebody else has got to, I got to hand it over to somebody else. And ultimately in 2025, we might see what we want. But it is a progressive point to change society and systemic racism. It doesn't happen overnight.
Yes. Thank you both. I appreciate your minds and your time. They have been gifts and graces to us, this entire community. And I say, with the suffragist movement finding roots, having roots in the abolitionist movement, and with women garnering the right to vote, securing that right, that sacred franchise, and later African Americans securing it. And now there are so many devices to suppress it. The right to vote must be of power. It must be powerful, ladies and gentlemen, if people fought for it, died for it, and are fighting to suppress it. And so you have a sacred franchise and you ought to use it to that end. Thank you so much. We're going to close with a little bit of the I Have a Dream speech. Valerie, Colbert, Osamuede, Brenda, Braceful, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody that's watching on YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitch, and Facebook. We will do a little bit of the I Have a Dream speech.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Appreciate it being here. Could just be my Lordy. I can't hear it. Oh, let me put my
of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check. A check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great cost of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. we have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. They have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote, and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities. Knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. Every hill and mountain shall be made low. The rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. And when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last."